Today's word is monopsony. This is not a word I made up. It comes from economics. It kind of means the opposite of a monopoly. In a monopoly, you have one supplier to the entire market. You have many customers, one seller, one producer. Of course, it's nice to be a monopoly. You've got no competition. You can set the prices you want, and if people want that product from any source, they have to get it from you. A monopsony is kind of the opposite of that. It's where you have one customer for many suppliers. They're not very common. Typically, a monopsony has a single customer in the form of the government. So, for example, the defense industry has many players. Raytheon, Lockheed, Boeing, I think, makes fighter jets. There's only one real buyer for that stuff, and that's the government, the military. The Pentagon is the monopsonistic player in that field. Now, monopolies are rarely absolute, and monopsonies are the same way. There's usually, a little bit of outlet here and there. But when you have a monopoly, you have a company that has such a huge market share, is so central to the industry, that we just call it a monopoly. A monopsony is the same way. So if you're a defense contractor, maybe with the Pentagon's permission, you can sell to our allies. But basically, the main customer is the Pentagon. The main customer is the U.S. government. It's a monopsony. And I bring this up because science in the United States has become a monopsony. If you think about the funding of science, where does the money come from? Who pays scientists to do science? Most of them work for universities or colleges, and so you might imagine that the students' tuition pays their salary. That's who's paying them to do science. But there's probably an element of that, but most students, if you could carve out the student tuition that goes to getting professors to teach and that which goes to them doing research, it's hard to imagine that the students really have a tremendous incentive to pay those teachers to do research rather than teach them. They have some incentive because they can get involved in the research and it raises the prestige of the professor. So they might pay something for that, but not nearly to the tune of what research costs. Really, if you think about it, the people paying scientists to do science is almost entirely the government at this point. The NIH, the NSF, agencies like that, they control the purse strings of basic research in the United States. There is some corporate sponsorship of science. It's usually, how to make a better shampoo or something like that. It tends not to be basic research, although there are exceptions. Pharmaceutical industry does a lot of basic research, for example, and a few other people. And there are some private foundations here and there that will fund things. I know of no private foundation whose specific purpose is to fund things that can't get government funding, though. There's not a lot of competition for funding in science. If you are a scientist, your money, the money you make from doing science, overwhelmingly comes from the government. Now, that's pathological. That's problematic for science because it places control of science not in the hands of scientists, but in the hands of politicians. An example of this would be George W. Bush squelched stem cell research in the United States at one point. And at least stem cell research done with embryonic stem cells. And he had a moral reason for doing it that you can agree with or disagree with, but don't get distracted by that. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the fact that the President of the United States announced that there would be no more research in the United States on such and such a thing. There is no legal authority by which the president has that right. If you look at the Constitution, science is mentioned only in connection with the patent office. The idea that the government can or should control scientific research, that's not a constitutional principle at all, anywhere. What George Bush was asserting was the de facto power he had as the highest ranking official in the executive branch of the government to stop funding for that kind of research. And without government funding, there was no meaningful research on that subject. That should frighten you if you're a scientist. That is not the place of government. that cannot be good for science to have politicians controlling it. This is a problem. Bush also famously tried to tinker with some studies that were reporting on global warming. Bush was an oil man, didn't like the conclusions. That should bother you. There was an outcry over it. There was an uproar, and he backed off. But the mechanism of a public outcry when the president tries to tinker with science funding, that's not a reliable mechanism. What if it was something that had more popular appeal? I think at the end of the day, scientists have an obligation to cultivate competition in the funding sources of science. Scientists don't like to think about this stuff. It's not their bailiwick. They're not economists. They just just give them the money, let them go in the lab and do their thing. But this is a real failure on the part of science as a community. It endangers the scientific epistemology itself. It endangers the integrity of science. A few years ago, Warren Buffett, who's older than sin itself at this point, he knows he doesn't have that much longer to go, and you gotta love Buffett. He made the statement he wants to leave his kids enough that they can do anything, but not enough that they can do nothing. So he left them, I don't know what he left them, a few $1 million or something. But the guy's worth, last I heard, $75,000 million, something like that. And he was looking around for where to leave his money. He eventually ended up leaving most of it to the Gates Foundation. And nothing against the Gates Foundation, but they are in fact a private funding agency that funds some basic research, not under the government umbrella. So that's good. But I really think another foundation would have been better. The more foundations competing with each other to fund scientific research, the better off science is. I don't think the thought ever crossed Buffett's mind. Why would it? He's not a scientist. It's not his area. I think scientists had an obligation to put that before him and didn't. So that is the task, I think, for scientists, is not just to do good science, but to secure the integrity of science by making sure there is a competition in funding sources. And that's today's word, monopsony. These videos and the words I propose, I'm hoping are not just me spouting off, but that they're stimulating enough to the people who watch them that you can expand upon them and make your own contributions to them, or make your arguments against them and why they should be constructed differently. I'm hoping for a real conversation in the comment section. So please, by all means, contribute in the comment section. Let me know your thoughts. And if you enjoy the process, then please like, share, and subscribe. And I will see you in the next video.